Welcome to Love Factually, the podcast that analyzes rom-coms and romantic films using the science of close relationships. We're your hosts, Paul Eastwick and Eli Finkel. Eli, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about Marriage Story, Noah Baumbach's lacerating multiple Oscar-nominated masterpiece from 2019. Some of the themes we'll explore are what happens when we take our relationship for granted, how divorce affects children, and why it's absurd to view marriage in terms of winning and losing.
And fair warning, we'll be spoiling this movie today, so if you don't know that the rental company can't buckle the booster seat for liability reasons, you have to do it yourself, then go watch this movie and come back. So Eli, who are the key characters and couples in this movie?
The main characters in Marriage Story are Charlie and Nicole Barber, the husband and wife in the film's titular marriage, who are about 35 or 40 years old and devoted parents to their 8-year-old son, Henry. Charlie, played by Adam Driver, is a MacArthur-winning director in New York. He is completely absorbed by the avant-garde theater company he created. Nicole, played by Scarlett Johansson, was a promising film actor in LA before marrying Charlie and starring in his plays. After years of feeling stifled and overlooked in New York, she moves to Los Angeles in pursuit of personal and professional independence. The other key characters in Marriage Story are LA divorce lawyers. Nora, whom Nicole hires despite agreeing with Charlie that theirs would be a lawyerless divorce, is played by Laura Dern to Oscar-winning perfection. She's a skilled and tenacious advocate for Nicole's interests. Bert, played by Alan Alda, is Charlie's first lawyer. He's gentle and moderately priced with a core humanity that appeals to Charlie, at least until Charlie realizes that competing with Nora will require a knife fighter. That knife fighter is Jay, played by Ray Liotta, who escalates the battle against Nora and Nicole. So, Paul, those are the chess pieces. Are you ready to give us 1 minute on how the film moves them across the board?
All right, let's go.
On your mark. Get set, go.
Charlie, a successful theater director in New York, and Nicole, his actress wife, are listing what they love about each other, though we learn they're in mediation and barreling toward a divorce. They want to avoid lawyers and prioritize their young son, Henry. Nicole moves to LA to pursue a TV role, bringing Henry with her, even though Charlie's life and career remain in New York. Charlie assumes their arrangement is temporary, but Nicole starts establishing a new life in LA and consults a high-powered divorce attorney, Nora Fanshawe. Charlie is caught off guard by this and eventually hires his own lawyer, first the kind but ineffective Bert, then the more aggressive Jay. The custody battle becomes contentious and the legal process begins to drain them emotionally and financially, and their fights become both honest and brutal. After some uncomfortable interactions with the court evaluator, the divorce is finalized with a not quite 50-50 joint custody arrangement, with Nicole and Henry permanently remaining in LA. Later, we get a pair of musical numbers from company. Charlie takes up a residency in LA. He encounters Henry reading the letter Nicole once wrote for mediation, a list of all the things she loved about him, and she kindly offers for Henry to take Henry for an extra night.
Oh, very nice. You had 2 seconds to spare. Well done.
Okay. I was on a streak of misses.
You're back, dude.
I am happy to be back on top. Okay. So, yeah, what is your relationship to this movie?
Well, one of them is I'm a big fan of Noah Baumbach, but I'd like to focus instead about how this movie intersects with the courses I teach here at Northwestern. As you know, one of the courses I teach here is an undergraduate course on relationship science.
Right.
But I also teach MBA courses over in Kellogg, the School of Business over here, on negotiation. And so this movie is fun because it is both a story about a relationship and also a story about a negotiation. And so one of the parts that was especially interesting to me is when people are going through a divorce, they have 2 big options. One is they can do mediation, which is they are on the same team and they bring someone along who can help them figure out what they want to do together. And the other is litigation, where I get my lawyer and you get your lawyer and we compete. The lawyers are really only representing one of us, and now it is a competition. And you really see that stuff play out well in the course of this movie.
You know, I actually don't know a lot about negotiation, but what I find so interesting about this is that, look, like mediation, like the way that they relate to each other feels like a relationship, and something doesn't feel relational anymore.
That's right.
Once the lawyers are involved, and that's at least how I think about negotiation.
That's
that means we're not working with a personal relationship anymore. This is about like, okay, well, what's halfway between reasonable and crazy? Like, okay, so we're both going to go as extreme as possible.
Yeah, I mean, that is right. And there is some research, by the way, in the relationship space. People like Robert Emery and Dave Sabara and others have looked at what happens when people opt into mediation versus opt into litigation.
Oh, interesting.
And what they find is that when people opt into mediation, on average, they spend a whole lot less money divorcing, and the relationship benefits from doing it. That said, not everybody gets along well enough that they're willing to go with mediation over litigation. But it's certainly a good option for people who are able to do it.
That's fascinating. You know, for me, what this movie speaks to is the way that relationships are often tied to a place. And I have definitely experienced that. I don't think everybody goes through this, like the big move where you move to another city for a job, for one of you. I've definitely gone through that. And it's remarkable how often your relationship is shaped by where you are, and that when you go to a new place with sort of new norms and new rules and new daily patterns, that can really upend things in a major way. And so I really like how this movie is toying with that idea. There is an LA version of this couple and a New York version of this couple, and we're seeing the migration from one to the other.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what this movie gets right about the nature of close relationships. Why don't you take it first?
Yeah, so I'd like to start maybe by talking about this idea that comes up about there are winners and there are losers in a marriage. Like somebody's winning and somebody's losing. And I think the movie calls the absurdity of that point. And the movie is right on this. And some of the stuff, I mean, just by way of setting it up, you know, Nora, even at the end, this is Nicole's lawyer, even at the end is still very competitive. She's competitive throughout. And she's telling Nicole what she was able to get in the final agreement. And Nora says,
And whenever Charlie is in LA, I got the custody breakdown to be 55-45. So you'll have Henry an extra day every 2 weeks.
I thought we made it equal.
I tweaked it at the last minute. I just didn't want him to be able to say he got 50-50, bragging to his friends.
But I don't want to do that.
Take it. You won.
and there is research on this idea that people are, they differ. People differ in how competitively they view the world. You might remember one of the classics in my world is this 1970 paper by Hal Kelly and Anthony Stahelski, where they look at individual differences in how competitive people are. And what's so interesting about that research is people who are competitive bring out competitiveness in others, and then they conclude that they have to be competitive because the world is dog eat dog. But they don't realize they're the ones who created that. And more recently, Paul von Lange has done work on social value orientation. Some people are individualistic, some people are competitive, some people are pro-social. And once you are interacting with a competitive person, you don't have much choice other to become sort of competitive yourself. And that happens to Charlie. You remember that awful fight. Presumably this will come up multiple times. But he says, like, you're fucking insane and you're fucking winning. And he punches the wall, right? He's so angry. And I don't think that's really who Charlie is. Like, he's not a competitive person by nature, but he's now in this situation that's making him like that. And Bert, Charlie's first lawyer, is the only one who is really keeping track of the fact that this isn't about winning and losing. And he says to Charlie, it doesn't make sense, does it? The reason you're doing this is because you love your kid. And in doing so, you're draining money from your kid's education. And I do think that the movie, Baumbach, from the start, knows that once you get into this competitive headspace, you're fighting a fool's errand, because marriage, even divorce, isn't about winning and losing. You can't win at marriage. You can't even really win at divorce, because it's a relationship. It's something that we need to figure out together.
Yeah, I mean, this is related to, I think, one of the other great things that the movie calls out. And we get this portrait of what their relationship is like as Nicole is talking with Nora for the first time.
Yeah.
And she says,
this pilot came along, it shot in LA, and it paid so much. And it was like there was this little lifeline thrown to me. Here's this bit of earth that's yours. And I was embarrassed about it in front of him, but it was also like, yeah, this is who I am, and this is what I'm worth. And maybe it's stupid, but at least it's mine. And if he had just taken me into a big hug and said, baby, I'm so excited for your adventure. Of course I want you to have a piece of earth that's yours. Then we might not be getting divorced. But he made fun of it and was jealous like he is. And then he realized about the money. And he told me I could funnel it back into the theater company. And that's when I realized he truly didn't see me.
So I think what this nicely captures is what I would call a great secure base failure
Oh, yeah.
on the part of Charlie, or a capitalization failure on by Charlie, and that he completely missed the opportunity to be excited about something that Nicole was excited about.
Yeah.
And we know this from attachment theory with the concept of the secure base, that we need our partners to support us and celebrate us as we go out into the world and try new and risky things. And we want our partners to capitalize, is the term that we often use, but it means we want them to celebrate our successes, to revel in our good news. Mm-hmm. And when we don't feel like our partners are able to do that, it's like an absolute death knell for relationships. And, Charlie is not competitive by nature, but he is very focused on his goals. I mean, he knows what he wants. Yeah. He's very driven, and it's very admirable in a lot of ways. And that was working for them for a long time.
Right.
I'm sure we'll get to that. But in this moment, that prevented him from celebrating.
Yes.
And now you're speeding towards disaster in those if those moments are repeated.
You are totally right. He's self-centered. He really is self-centered, and he's a little judgmental. He does love his wife. He's a kind person. He loves her, and yet he can't get out of his own way with his self-centeredness. And he really missed an opportunity there. And I like the way Nicole is talking about it, that there was another path this relationship could have gone down.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, we do understand him to be self-centered. He is like that throughout the movie. And what I love about this example is, this is so simple.
Yes.
I think with the benefit of hindsight, of course he could have gone back and been happy for his wife in that moment. It's not like his opinion about TV is so powerful. It's like a moral,
completely
a moral outrage if he were to celebrate her in that moment. It's actually very simple. It's a simple thing that he missed, and that, I think, is what makes it all the more tragic in this case.
Yeah, it's interesting. It relates to another observation I had that I think the movie gets right, and I encoded this as the movie underscores how risky or dangerous it can be to take our partner for granted. There's this dialogue at the beginning of that really intense fight scene.
Yeah.
You don't remember promising that we could do time here?
We discussed things. We were married. We said things. We talked about moving to Europe, about getting a sideboard, or what do you call that, a credenza, to fill the empty space behind the couch. We never did any of it.
You turned down the residency at the Geffen that would have brought us here for a year.
It wasn't something I wanted. We had a great theater company and a great life where we were.
You call that a great life?
You know what I mean. I don't mean we had a great marriage. I mean life in Brooklyn. Professionally. I don't know. Honestly, I never considered anything different.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, I was your wife. You should have considered my happiness too.
Even at this point, when they're having this fight and they're in the midst of divorcing, he doesn't yet realize that he took her for granted. It's
right.
Way later. It's at the climax moment of the movie when he is singing the song "Being Alive" from Sondheim's 1970 musical Company. Now, in that musical, the protagonist thinks he doesn't want to be in a relationship. They're just a big hassle. He says, like, someone to need you too much, somebody to know you too well, somebody to pull you up short, to put you through hell. He thinks, who would ever want that thing? And what's cool about that song, going back to 1970, is the position shifts. The protagonist shifts midway through the song, and instead of this third-party distance critic of what marriage is like, he starts to realize, wait, I do want this. This like messiness and discomfort and difficulty. This is what it is to be alive, and I want to be a part of it. And we see Charlie in his own rendition of this song. He starts realizing the same thing, but in contrast to Robert from the play, who is deciding, well, maybe I'll decide to enter this relationship. Charlie is at the end. And what's dawning on Charlie's mind as he's singing the song, as he makes it his way from the first half to the second half of the song, is, I had all this and it felt like too much, and maybe it wasn't really worth it, and I didn't really appreciate it. And now he thinks, how did I ever let that go?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of work on the importance of sort of feeling appreciated or not taking for granted. Amy Gordon has done crucial work in this space, Sarah Aljo. And what we can see is that even from the outside, even external observers can tell when somebody is really appreciating their partner, and he just failed. He just didn't appreciate her when he had the opportunity.
Yeah, and in fact, in the Samantha Joel 2020 mega review of a whole bunch of relationship science studies where she was using these machine learning approaches to see which construct was most powerful at predicting satisfaction and commitment, actually appreciation was like number 3.
Oh, I'd forgotten that.
So it was very high up there, right? It's right under intimacy at number 2 and perceived partner commitment at number 1.
Interesting.
So appreciation is especially important. But I'm glad you brought this up, because the Sam Joel 2020 paper is going to come up again. And it's going to come up again in relation to, I think, one of the other interesting quotes in this movie. This is actually one of the guys in the office, in Jay's office, and he says, criminal lawyers see bad people at their best. Divorce lawyers see good people at their worst.
Yeah.
And so this is so helpful for crystallizing, for me, one of the key points of close relationships research that I think people find very counterintuitive, and that is that relationship skills only get you so far, really.
Interesting.
That being a good person or being a not so good person, maybe being a little self-centered, being a bit unable to communicate what it is that you want, right? These people can be in good relationships for a while, and yet when a relationship falls apart, it will take people who are good and bring out the worst in them, okay? So this explains, I think, why Sam Joel in that study found that the particular personality characteristics of your partner actually do very little to explain how happy you are in that relationship. And again, I think that fits with the idea that, like, hey, sometimes good people are in bad relationships that are going sideways. Sometimes bad people are in relationships that are actually kind of going well, and that the individual differences can only go so far at explaining what works and what doesn't work.
It's interesting. We've talked about some of these individual differences. I think when talking about Before Sunrise, we talked about the personality trait of neuroticism, and you and I had some discussion about, like, how big an effect is it? So if I am high in the personality trait of neuroticism, how much does that affect my partner's happiness in the relationship? And again, your read of the evidence is that those effects are surprisingly small. Why is that? Like, why wouldn't it matter much to my partner whether I'm, like, filled with these easygoing personality characteristics versus these more difficult ones?
It's great. I mean, I think the movie shows us why. And it shows us that it's really about establishing patterns that either are bad and you don't realize it, or are going to become bad and you aren't paying attention enough to try to reconfigure and reboot them in some ways. So he's very self-assured. He knows what he wants. He's self-centered, okay? She doesn't know what she wants as much. She's very kind, but she's a little bit more adrift. Are those bad qualities as a general rule? Are those bad qualities when you pair them together? I think probably not. I think we would have a very hard time finding evidence that those were bad qualities across the board, or even that they were bad in combination. But what was bad was that they created a dynamic that at first she was happy with. She was happy to get caught up in his dream and his vision. but it left no space for her. And they were both uncurious about what that meant. And so over time, she gets angry, he gets blindsided. If anything, for me, and again, I'm now coming at this from a theoretical rather than an empirical place, it's the uncuriosity that is the one thing to fear. If people were asking me what is the one thing, like a trait, to be wary of in a relationship, I wouldn't say neuroticism. I wouldn't say self-centeredness. I would say, do you become uncurious about where we are and how we got here? That's the thing that would make me nervous, and that's what they did.
Yeah, they got into a pattern, and both of them for a while, and then he continued to be uncurious, to question, how are we doing in the space of possible ways that we could engage with one another? Have we found a space that's working for both of us? And for a while, both of them weren't asking that question. Then she started asking that question, and he wasn't willing to go down that road.
That brings up this other really cool finding. I'll just mention this really briefly because it's a cool recent paper from Janina Buehler that looks at the trajectories of people headed for divorce and breakup. And what she finds is that, things might be on a slight downward slide for a while, but there's this period of transition where people start sliding down dramatically in terms of their satisfaction. It can be 6 months before the final break. It can be a couple of years. But usually what happens is one person starts that slide first, and then the other person starts it later but catches up.
Fascinating.
So that's what she shows there.
And it's interesting. So one way of tying that back to what you were saying before is, the personality traits can't explain that pattern, right? The personality traits can't explain why everything is fine, and then rather suddenly everything went amiss. And I understand you to be saying, and I'm intrigued by this in light of the evidence, that sure, individual differences do matter. It's not nothing. But the overwhelming lion's share of explaining why it is that things were kind of okay, and then abruptly one of us started going south and then the other one followed, is that our patterns became corrosive, or something about the dynamic between the two of us changed in a profound way.
I do believe this to be one of the things that close relationships researchers can say, is that it's in the dynamic that is created, and those are the things you have to be paying attention to and be willing to fix if you want to keep your relationship going.
This discussion about their personality differences and whether that was instrumental in why they ended up having a difficult time, I'm very persuaded by what you're saying. I also find it interesting to consider the ways that personality might matter in relationships, separate from, on average, do they predict good or bad?
Yeah, sure.
And one of the things that I found so exciting about this movie is, I think one way in which these two people really differ, in which the married couple just really differs, is he knows exactly who he is and what he wants, and she just isn't quite as sure. And what can happen in a dynamic like that is she never quite speaks with the level of urgency and certainty about what her needs are, whereas he always knows, and he gets confused.
Always knows,
He's confused about it. He thinks, well, if she really cared, she would surely sound different, because his experience of the world is that when you know what you want, it doesn't sound wishy-washy like this. And we hear this early on when Nicole is first explaining to Nora what the issue is. She says things like, I didn't even know what my taste was because I was never asked to use it, or I never came alive for myself. I was only feeding his aliveness. Now, she wasn't angry about these things, right? They just were the reality. And so one of the things that this movie made vivid for me that I hadn't really thought of before, but there is some research that is consistent with this idea, is that Nicole needed to go nuclear. That is, the way she was going to be able to deal with this wasn't going to be like, hey, let's just have a reasonable conversation. And that ends up feeling moral, right? That is, Charlie is like, look, we don't need a lawyer, whatever you want. Let's all just be reasonable people. But he's such a strong personality, and she's so much less of a strong personality than he is. And
she needed a lawyer to buck her up.
She needed a warrior
to advocate for herself.
That's exactly right. And it made me feel differently about the movie. Like I remember watching it for the first time a while back and thinking, her lawyer is awful, and even Nicole herself was like kind of awful in some ways. Now, look, the movie is very, very fair. Both of the spouses are awful. They're both great, but the movie is fair. But I ended up much more sympathetic to Nicole on this viewing because she just needed a way. She wasn't ever going to be able to get what she needed or wanted through like good discourse and reasonableness with Charlie. She needed a fighter, and that was the way she was going to get out of this. And here again, there's some interesting research on this idea called locomotion in interdependence dilemmas. This is Paul von Lange again, and what he's interested in it is not just when do people like break up or when are they happy or unhappy. He wants to understand the circumstances under which people feel like I don't want to engage with that person again, or I don't want to engage under those circumstances again. And I think this is what we're seeing here, is she just can't go where she wants to go. And so she has to do this thing where she opts out of the marriage, gets a fighter, and leaves. And that's the way she's going to be able to live the life she wants to live.
Right. It really, this movie is about her having to go nuclear in various ways. She has to go nuclear to take Henry to LA. She has to go nuclear to get Nora, right? It has to be all of these steps where she has to keep escalating to break out of his powerful grip, which is just who he is as a person. It's
right.
Not
he's
evil.
not a bad person. And it worked for her for a long time and could have continued working if he'd handled some other stuff better. But when it stopped working, she needed a way out.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about one of the other things that this movie shines a light on, which we don't see that often in these movies, and that is, what is the effect of divorce on kids? I mean, this was like a huge debate for a long time in relationships and family research. I think we now fully appreciate that divorce does increase the risk of negative outcomes for kids. But we also know that most kids eventually get back to baseline, that the process of going through the divorce is often what's tough on kids. I mean, we kind of see Henry bristling at many of these changes. He seems like a really mild-mannered kid who is nevertheless getting a little ornery and a little bit upset. But I think we are to understand that once the intense period of the divorce is over, that he's more or less gotten back to baseline. And that is really the normative pattern that you see with most kids in the wake of divorce.
It is interesting, right? Because this is a pretty important question, because most of us would really rather not mess up our children. And we face a really serious dilemma if we feel like we're really struggling to figure out a way to live a fulfilling life or to be happy in this marriage.
Yeah.
Many of us would be willing to endure that if it's good for our kids. And it has been interesting as the data have continued to roll in, that assuming that the divorce doesn't remain toxic in perpetuity, that there are paths forward for the children.
It really does seem like it's the toxicity and the conflict, whether that's in a marriage or whether it's in the process of getting divorced or whether it's in the wake of the divorce. I mean, that's where the challenges are. Now, of course, most of these studies are not causal.
Right.
And
you can't
so
randomly assign people to get divorced.
That is correct. So that brings up the question of, okay, well, how much of this is sort of genetic, and like whether you continue to live a unfulfilling life or move on to something else, like, is that really going to affect your kids? And so there is some work on, like twin studies where they try to pull out the genetics of this.
Interesting.
And this is like work by Brian D'Onofrio. And what they tend to show is that basically some of the effects are genetic and some might not be. Okay, so like effects on like kids, like mood disorders, like depression, that's probably genetic, right?
Wait, let me just make sure I'm getting it.
Yeah.
That is the elevated risk of depression as a function of having had parents who divorced versus didn't divorce. It looks like there's a big genetic component to the risk of getting depressed if your parents divorce.
Right. It's like depression is associated with divorce, and your parents got divorced, and your parents are probably also have more genes that predispose them to depression, and so you got those genes. So the divorce probably was not causal.
Interesting.
But substance abuse, it might be causal. Right? So it depends on, right? That's a story where actually maybe the divorce is causing strife, is causing conflict, and therefore causes more substance abuse problems in the kids.
Fascinating.
So anything else about what this movie gets right?
No, I could talk a long time. I'm sort of terrified that we're about to get into the misconceptions, and I'm hoping you have a lot of good stuff in here because I was scraping the bottom of the barrel.
I have almost nothing in this category. I mean, I'll ask you this, Dr. Negotiations. Because I really don't know, how often are negotiations this incompatible, right? Two different cities on either sides of the country, and we have narrowed this down to a singular issue, which is kind of what he does. And I guess I just wondered, like not to say that this can't happen or doesn't happen, but I wondered if, look, most times in a divorce, even when lawyers are involved, there are many things that we are trading over.
Yeah.
There is not one singular thing that is the thing in this movie that really escalates it. So I was just curious, negotiations, what do you have to say?
Not very often. And in fact, And in fact, it's largely a choice to view it that way. I mean, they had many things they could have been negotiating over, and it got reduced, at least significantly reduced to like, are we going to do LA or are we going to do New York? And that was everything was tied up in that. But we've already talked a little bit. Like, I don't think this marriage had to end. I think there was a happy solution for this couple. They would have had to have played in a more multidimensional space. But your point about it being very complicated to resolve single issue incompatible negotiations, like those are really difficult. The canonical example, or one of them that we use in our class, actually was a negotiation between Israel and Egypt in the 1970s. So these were nations that had gone to war repeatedly. And what actually was really complicated for this one was what to do with the Sinai Desert. So the history buffs here might remember that in 1967, Israel won a war and they claimed an enormous amount of Egyptian territory, and Egypt did not like that. And here they are, they've been to war a bunch of times. And they were negotiating in the late 1970s, and there was no way to draw the line on the map, right? The America was negotiating this, and there was no line they could draw on the map about how to split the desert in a way that was acceptable for both sides. And it wasn't until they realized that there wasn't one issue here, but multiple issues. So Israel actually didn't care about the land. They cared about security. And so they didn't feel like they could turn the land back over to Egypt and feel like there wouldn't be tanks on their border, whereas Egypt cared about sovereignty, right? And what they really cared about is like, look, the Western nations, again, deciding what's going to happen in the Middle East. And so there was a solution, but only once the two sides realized that it seems like we're fighting over how much land each of us is going to get. But underneath that issue, there are other issues, and there may be compatible issues underlying incompatible positions. And I don't think that this couple did everything they could have done to try to solve that.
That's right. But again, I can't put this honestly in misconceptions, because what the movie is trying to tell us is that if you focus on a singular issue without being able to see the multiple issues underneath, this is what you get. So the movie continues to win. I got one other small thing I could try.
Good.
Okay. So again, now I'm like, this is probably like the speech that won Laura Dern the Oscar. But she says, in one brief moment, let's face it, the idea of a good father was only invented like 30 years ago. It's an incredible speech. It's mostly a speech about how women have to meet higher standards than men, and you see that empirically across the board.
Right.
I just wanted to note that actually the idea of a good father has been around for a long time. Again, my favorite is like, let's look at Jane Austen. Jane Austen has many different kinds of father role models. Some are terrible, some are kind and affectionate and wonderful.
Yeah.
All of these different role models existed. And I've talked about this before too. Look, men evolved over the last 6 million plus years to be smaller, gentler, more similar in size to females. The females wanted the males to be smaller and gentler. They selected those males, not the big hulking brutes, because being careful around children was part of the new mating arrangement, part of the new pair bonding arrangement. So anyway, it wasn't really invented 30 years ago. It's a great line. It's still not really fair to hit the movie for this. Laura Dern, your Oscar. You get to keep it.
Yeah. She deserves it. Look, I mean, I'm at the level of these things too. I mean, a couple things that if I have to pick, neither partner treats his infidelity as much of a big deal, at least not.
Oh, that's a good point.
Relative to the other grievances. I'm not saying that's wrong. Well, it might not have been as...
It kind of does, but kind of not. I get it.
It comes up, but I don't... It's not really what they focus on. Even Nicole doesn't really get into it that much. And the other one is the dynamic involving her mother is a little weird. So we would typically expect that her support, she's all in on Charlie. She's all in, right? So we would expect that her support for Charlie would increase the odds that Nicole would be into him, or that there would be some meaningful rift such that now that they're splitting up, that Nicole's mom and Charlie have to have more of a schism. That doesn't really happen. So they're in this sort of nebulous place that surely is plausible. I didn't see any issue with it, but it's hard to reconcile with exactly what we see on average in the literature.
I agree. It's obvious we're struggling.
We're struggling.
We're
doing
struggling
the
here.
best we can.
Well, let's move on to Are We Okay With This? Because, there's interesting moral questions that are wrapped up in this movie, too. And I'm curious what your take is, especially when you think about what does this movie recommend, or how does it feel about marriage and the institution and what people should be doing in their relationships?
I think this is a sad story because I think they should have made it. I don't mean that morally. I mean there were many paths that these two people could have gone down that would have done it. And for me, the thing that resonates the most with that point of view is that part where it's like the epilogue scene. He goes out to visit them in LA and he says to Nicole, I got a residency at UCLA and I'm going to be directing a couple films out here. And she, Scarlett Johansson is an amazing actor. I mean, both of them are just astoundingly great in this film. And the look on her face is... She appreciates it. She says it's good, but she has this distant anguish about her face, so much so that he says, are you okay? Is everything okay? And she says, yeah, it's only good because it's too late, because that is exactly what she needed not very long ago. And it wasn't in his ability at that point, for whatever reason, to offer it. But now that it's on offer, again, it's too late now, but it's what she needed. And they should have gone down this road where he was accommodating her career as well. It was totally within reach, I think.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess what I find very interesting about this movie, with respect to what it's trying to say about marriage, is I don't know if it is coming down hard on the side of, okay, you just need to work harder and pay attention and not let the thing get away from you. Or is it trying to say that from the jump, these two were doomed? They were doomed from the moment she went to New York in the first place without herself and got together with this guy that was going to be. And again, I know what to recommend to people. What I recommend to people is pay attention and be curious about your relationship. But once they've gotten to this place, once they've gotten to the moment that we meet them in this relationship, I struggle with what to tell them or what would be right or what I would tell a friend to do in this circumstance. I
don't have an easy answer to that. I think the movie is so interesting because pretty much everything that happens in this movie is a moral quandary. I mean, it's just so sophisticated. For example, when, if ever, is it acceptable to hack into our partner's emails or texts? If we stop having sex with our partner, when might it be acceptable for them to start having sex with somebody else? I mean, these aren't even central ideas in the movie, but throughout this fight, throughout this whatever uncoupling that they're doing, you're seeing these things. For me, there's a huge issue that I find extremely interesting, which is about change. It's about, like, you and I start a relationship, and of course, we start a relationship with a certain set of assumptions and patterns. Now, you've called a question about the dangers of really settling into those, and they should, be held tentatively, and we should be curious about what other patterns exist. But I don't think you believe the extreme version where, like, no patterns are ever set. Of course, there is something about who we
you
are.
just reinvent your relationship in a moment.
Every day.
Patterns are very useful. I mean, we land on certain patterns because they work for us, right? And so, you can't just blow everything up on a moment's notice. It doesn't work either.
So think about the moral issue at play. So imagine you and I got married, and we were in a set of patterns that you and I both understood to be very good for us. And some number of years in, either because kids arrived or I changed or something, that pattern doesn't work for me anymore. Morally speaking, how should we think about that? So one possibility is that you are justified in feeling morally aggrieved in saying, like, wait, we had a deal, we had an understanding, and now you're going back on what we agreed to when we decided to get married. Fair enough. I think that is a completely reasonable perspective. There is another moral perspective that perhaps I would have, which is, surely you didn't plan to, like, put me in a box and never allow me to grow, right? Of course I should have the ability to grow and change, and it's your responsibility as my spouse to work with me to make sure that we've come to a new set of patterns together that work. But when we can't do that, when I have changed in ways that the old patterns don't work and we're struggling to come up with new patterns, is it my moral failing? Is it your moral failing? Has neither one of us failed and we just shrug our shoulders? I don't know how to think about it, but the movie raises those sorts of questions.
It's a great point, and I'm tempted to think, like, look, neither of those are anybody's fault. Mm-hmm. But the problem is, on the one hand, are you paying attention to your partner and whether they need a pattern to change? Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, are you paying attention to your own need to change? And are you able to vocalize those things, etc.? And so those failures are, if not, they're not morally bad, but they're gonna bring you to the bad outcome that you don't want. Let's get to best relationship quotes. We've had a few, but here, I'll start with one. So this is, again, in that great early speech by Nicole, and she says,
He talked to me, and I talked back. The dead part wasn't dead. It was just in a coma. And it was better than the sex, the talking. Although the sex was also like the talking. Everything's like everything in a relationship. Do you find that?
Okay, so that's a great quote because it rings very true.
Good.
But also, empirically, I would like to tell you about this great paper by Dr. James Kim.
And Dr. Paul Eastwick.
And yes, I'm a later author on this paper. What we basically show is that whenever you get people to self-report on things in their relationship, it's all kind of one big blob of positivity.
Yeah.
Sometimes we call this sentiment override, okay? So, but it's what she's articulating here, which is like, if the sex is good, then the talking seems good. And if the talking seems good, then the sex seems good. Yeah. And if everything seems good, then everything else seems good. Or alternatively, if everything seems bad, then everything else seems bad. People are actually kind of bad at differentiating the different micro components of their relationship. For the most part, things are all good or all middling or all bad.
This is the one that I wanted to flag here, too. We've talked about other good quotes, and I actually have one coming up when we were talking about what we wish we knew. But this was the one I had here, and for the same reason. I love this idea, and it was better than sex, the talking, although the sex was also like the talking. Everything's like everything in a relationship. It is just such a great insight about the fact that there's this amalgamation of, like, this feels good.
Yeah. It's this thing that's, like, very frustrating for researchers because, we're like, I understand that sex is good. Will you please, like, tell me about your support processes? And what people are doing essentially is they just keep telling you that the sex is good over and over again. But this is a useful, we talk about motivated reasoning in relationships. Like, that's in many ways what this is. Mm-hmm. If I am I want this relationship. I want it to be good, so I see it all as good, okay? And when things are deteriorating, you're also motivated to see everything as bad.
Yeah.
It's actually very hard for people to take a nuanced view of something, as all-consuming as a relationship, and be able to pick out the parts that are great and to pick out the parts that are not so great. It takes a lot of work.
Yeah, totally.
So what do we wish we knew about close relationships from this?
There's a lot of ideas in here that I would like to test. I think one that I think is especially interesting, it's this question of what happens when there's a relationship and then one of the people achieves fame or, in the parlance of the day, glows up. Now I know you have, both of us have some skepticism about
Mr. Vernacular over
Mr. Vernacular. I literally today turned 50 and yet somehow I'm still paying attention to the kids.
That's today. It's today. Look at this. Look at this guy's 50.
His second half of the century happening now in real time. But you and I both have developed some skepticism over time about whether people have generally appealing qualities or generally not that appealing qualities. Most of what makes people happy in a relationship is compatibility rather than just finding somebody good.
Right.
Nonetheless, there is, the poor kid who, is really good at baseball and now makes $27 million a year and is very famous and so forth. And you see something like this happen to Charlie. And there's this part where they're fighting and she says to him,
You fucked somebody we worked with.
You stopped having sex with me in the last year. I never cheated on you.
That was cheating on me.
But there's so much I could have done. I was a director in my 20s who came from nothing and was suddenly on the cover of fucking Time Out New York. I was hot shit and I wanted to fuck everybody and I didn't. And I loved you and I didn't want to lose you. But I'm in my 20s and I didn't want to lose that too and I kind of did. And you wanted so much, so fast. I didn't even want to get married. Fuck it! There's so much I didn't do.
And this question about they got together and then after they were together, he became kind of a star and apparently women were throwing themselves at him. And that's a change in the dynamic. And I don't think we as a field know much about how those sorts of shifts, these sorts of social status or fame shifts that sometimes happen in a relationship influence the dynamic between the two partners.
Yeah, it's fascinating because on the one hand, look, there are lots of famous examples of this, right? When somebody rises to stardom and they're in a deep and meaningful relationship before that point, oftentimes that partner becomes a former partner. At the same time, we know that, I think what he's trying to tell us here is that the motivated reasoning that we all engage in, the positive biases we have for our partners keep us in those relationships. But we're not entirely unaware of the fact that we're doing it, and that might come up on a ledger later.
Interesting.
When we're
he's keeping track. He knows that he's been making the sacrifice.
Right, exactly. So happy to make the sacrifice, but that will come up if I feel aggrieved at a later point. I picked up on an issue that's related to, you bring in the lawyers, that turns it from a relational context into a negotiation context, and now we are battling it out, okay? It's obvious that that's going to be a much less friendly process. But I wonder, too, how much people's social networks can kind of stoke that same thing. Because, a lot of times if your friends are being independent observers of your relationship and they're on your side, they might be pushing people to become more adversarial. What? You do all of these chores or you do all of those chores? And that, I wonder, does that get people to see injustices where they would have found a more mediational compromise in the absence of that? I worry about this because I really do believe that relationships require that insider perspective, the desire to mediate and take on the other person's needs as their own. But sometimes I worry that outside forces encourage the battles, encourage the competition. And that's not ideal.
I think the closest thing that I've seen in the literature on this is work by Jeff Green and others on third-party forgiveness. And the idea is that, like, my best friend is less forgiving of my partner than I am. Informally, Jeff was calling it the mother-in-law effect, right?
That's cool.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's cool. That's great. That's great. And at least, right, with respect to Charlie's mother-in-law in this movie.
It's a different case.
She was willing to help out. But yeah, it did make me wonder about friends in a broader context.
Yeah.
On this podcast, we rate movies from 1 to 5 stars. I'll go first, and this is one of the easiest ratings I have had to make on this show. It is a 5-star film.
Yeah.
Oh my God. The real feat, we've hinted at this a bit, but that this movie can get you to be able to identify with both of them, okay? And if you watched this movie and you found yourself identifying with one of them but not the other, I challenge you
watch it again.
to erase your brain and watch it again.
Hit reboot.
And I can nearly guarantee you will be able to see the movie from the other person's perspective. What a feat.
It is, and that happened to me. It's a 5-star movie. I remember loving it and admiring it, but it wasn't until I really immersed myself in the last few days that I realized just how brilliant it is. The characters are rich, the scenes are evocative, the experiences feel so real. Like they collectively, Baumbach and then the actors in general, just a magnificent work of art.
Yeah. Well, on this podcast, we also rate movies on Rust Bolts. Now, the Rust Bolt is named after Eli's advisor, the late, great Carol Rust Bolt, pioneer of close relationships research, with 5 stars indicating a near-perfect depiction of the nature of close relationships. So where are you on Rust Bolts?
I wish the scale went higher than 5.
Yeah, right.
It is a 5 Rust Bolt, 5-star masterpiece.
Yeah, I'm also at 5 Rust Bolts here. As you could hear, we struggled to come up with misconceptions in this movie, but it gets so much right, too. Totally. It hits so many things that a lot of movies hit clunkily or don't hit nearly as well. For me, it was the establishing patterns. The effect of divorce on kids, that was well articulated, made it seem like not such a scary thing, which I think is appropriate. Lots of good stuff in here, but this has been the Love Factually podcast. I am Paul Eastwick. I have been here with Eli Finkel. And Eli, I look forward to doing this with you next time.
I look forward to it as well. Hopefully it'll be just as good as this one. The Love Factually podcast is produced and edited by Paul Eastwick and Eli Finkel, featuring music from Andrew Fraker and Sons. To learn more about the research we discussed in this episode, find the notes on our Substack. That's lovefactually.substack.com.